They didn't call it a cold snap. They called it the winter, because once you lived through Britain in early 1963, you stopped measuring cold by days. You measured it by weeks, by the way the snow didn't leave, by the way ice became normal, by the way the country slowed down until it felt like time itself had frozen. And what makes this winter unforgettable isn't only the numbers on a thermometer, it's what it did to ordinary life. It made homes feel smaller. It made roads feel unreliable. It made simple routines feel like hard work. And it left behind a kind of memory that people still carry decades later. The kind you can trigger with a single image: a frozen river, a street buried in snow, a fire struggling to heat one room, a kettle boiling again and again because warmth had to be created. This is the story of the winter of 1963, the one Britain will never forget. Not a romantic version, the real version. It didn't arrive like a single dramatic snowstorm that blew in and disappeared. It settled in. Late December 1962 started turning colder, then colder again, until the cold became set, the kind that locks into the ground. Snow fell, refroze, fell again, packed down, turned to ice, then got buried under more snow. And suddenly, Britain wasn't having winter weather. Britain was living inside winter weather. By January 1963, cold stopped being an event and became the default setting. A month of days where the temperature often struggled to rise, where frost felt permanent, and where the air itself seemed heavier. If you've never experienced a long freeze, it's hard to explain the psychological part. At first, snow feels exciting. Then it becomes inconvenient. Then it becomes exhausting. Because the longer it lasts, the more it changes everything. Not with one big dramatic moment, but with constant pressure. You wake up and the world is still white. You go to sleep and you know it will still be white. You stop expecting change. And when a country stops expecting change, it starts living differently. Now picture the Britain of 1963. This is crucial, because modern people imagine dealing with cold in a modern home, with central heating, double glazing, tumble dryers, and instant hot water everywhere. But for many families in 1963, warmth was not automatic. Warmth was a project. A lot of homes relied on a fireplace, a gas fire, or whatever heating they had in the main living room. Many households lived by a rule that sounds like a joke now, but it wasn't. One warm room. The living room became the survival zone. Doors stayed shut to trap heat. Curtains were pulled early. People layered clothing indoors, jumpers, cardigans, thick socks, and nobody expected the house to feel warm in every corner. Upstairs bedrooms could be brutal. Hallways could feel like outdoor air. Bathrooms could be icy. Getting dressed in the morning wasn't just routine, it was a sprint. So the house changed shape. Life shrank inward. Families gathered where the heat was, not because it was cosy in a trendy way, but because the rest of the house was losing the battle. And the colder it got, the more you felt it in the small details. Pipes freezing, windows icing, condensation turning into damp, laundry taking forever to dry, shoes staying wet. That constant feeling of cold hands. Not dramatic pain, just a low-level discomfort that followed you around like a shadow. And through it all, the kettle became the most important machine in Britain. Tea wasn't just a drink, it was a heat source, a reset button, a way of making the inside of your body feel normal again. Outside, the country transformed into something Britain rarely becomes. Rivers iced over. Ponds became skating surfaces. Snow drifts built up in places where the wind could shape them into walls. And it wasn't just a North story. It wasn't just Scotland or the hills. This freeze spread across the country in a way that turned familiar landscapes into something strange and almost continental. The most famous image is the one people still tell like a legend. Parts of the River Thames, freezing enough that skating took place. And, in one notorious moment, A car was driven across the frozen Thames near Oxford. A car. On the Thames. That's the kind of fact that doesn't feel British. But early 1963 wasn't behaving like a normal British winter, and it wasn't only rivers. Along some coasts, inshore sea ice appeared, the kind of sight that makes people stop and stare because the sea, in the British imagination, is supposed to move. It's supposed to be grey and restless. Now it was trapped. When the sea freezes near shore, it's not just cold. It's a message. It says, "This is extreme." Then came the practical damage. Because winter isn't only scenery, it's logistics. Britain runs on movement, deliveries, transport, work, school, supplies. And the Great Freeze made movement unreliable. Roads became treacherous under ice and compacted snow. Rural routes struggled. Buses couldn't always run. In some places, villages could become cut off, not because the country was helpless, but because the cold lasted so long that clearing became a constant chase. And when transport is inconsistent, life starts narrowing. Shops have less. Choice shrinks. People buy what's available rather than what they want. You plan differently. You ration your effort. And on top of that, cold creates a second kind of pressure. It makes the systems behind daily life more fragile. Electricity supply was strained, and there were power cuts and interruptions in early January. And the moment power becomes unstable, home life changes instantly. Lights go out, cooking becomes harder, heaters stop, evenings feel shorter, candlelight comes out, people cluster closer, conversations happen because there's nothing else to do. Kids can feel a weird excitement because it feels like a story. But adults often look tense because they understand what it means. When winter is already this hard, losing power makes everything harder. A hard winter can be survived. A hard winter plus unstable systems starts to feel like you're living on the edge of control. Now imagine being a child in 1963. You're not thinking about national infrastructure. You're thinking about your fingers hurting from cold. You're thinking about the walk to school, the wet socks, the way your breath looks in the air. In some schools, classrooms could be chilly. Coats stayed on longer. Heating was often limited. And yet, school carried on because the country still tried to keep routine intact. And routine mattered, because in a long freeze, routine becomes survival. When the weather makes everything unpredictable, the only thing that keeps people sane is the schedule. Meals, school, work, tea, bedtime. That's why so many memories of this winter are domestic. They aren't only about snow, they're about kitchens, living rooms, fires, hot water bottles, and the physical feeling of coming in from outside and standing near the heat, turning your hands toward it like you're charging them back to life. But winter, 1963, wasn't only about the cold, it was about duration. That's the key. A short cold snap is manageable. A month of deep freeze changes society. Snow cover lingered for weeks in many areas. Cold kept returning even when brief thaws teased people with hope. The country lived inside a cycle. Freeze, snow, drift, refreeze, again and again. The novelty disappeared. The inconvenience became normal. And then the inconvenience became fatigue. Because the longer winter lasts, the more it drains you in small ways. Everything takes longer. Everything costs more effort. Every trip requires planning. Every meal requires heat. Every bath feels like a mission. Every morning starts with the same cold shock. And if you're an adult trying to hold a household together, with work, with kids, with bills, with travel, the winter isn't just weather. It's pressure. There's another part people forget. Winter also hits the natural world hard. When rivers freeze and ground stays snow-covered, animals struggle for food. Birds, especially in harsh spells, can suffer badly. Farming and rural life face their own challenges. And that matters because 1963, Britain is still a country where many people are closer to the environment. More people walk, more people notice the weather's effects. More people live in a world where the local environment feels present in daily life. So the freeze wasn't an abstract thing. It was visible in everything. In frozen puddles that never became water again. In hard snow that turned into dirty ice. In the sound of boots crunching over a surface that used to be wet pavement. In breath turning into clouds every time you spoke. And yet, here's the strange truth. Ask people who lived through it, and you'll hear two different memories. One is hardship, the other is something almost like togetherness. Because extreme winters do something social. They slow everyone down. They push people back into the local world, neighbours, streets, communities. People check on each other more. People talk. People share small bits of advice and help. Kids play in snow for hours because it's there every day. Families gather in the warmest room because they have to. It wasn't a perfect, cheerful community movie. People still struggled. People still argued. Not everyone had it equally. But the freeze created a shared experience, and shared experiences become national memory. That's why 1963 still echoes. Millions of people can say, I remember where I was. I remember how the house felt. Because the winter forced those sensations into the body. Now let's be clear. Britain has seen cold winters before and after. But 1963 stands out because it pushed Britain into extremes that feel almost un-British. Not just cold and damp. Cold enough to freeze major waterways. Cold enough that the landscape stopped behaving normally. Cold enough that the British way of coping. Layers, tea, routine, make-do and mend thinking was tested over and over again. It became a benchmark. For decades, whenever Britain had a cold spell, people would say, it's not like 63. That phrase alone tells you everything. Because if a winter becomes the comparison point for a whole country, it wasn't just bad. It was defining. Eventually, the grip loosened. Not all at once. Not with one clean moment where the country suddenly returned to normal. It faded slowly, like a stubborn stain. Snow retreated, ice broke, roads reopened, movement returned. The feeling of being trapped inside winter began to lift. And when it did, people didn't just feel warmer, they felt released. Because the Great Freeze didn't only freeze landscapes, it froze plans, it froze routines, it froze the sense of the future is next week. When a winter takes over like that, time becomes repetitive. And when it ends, time starts moving again. If you want to understand why Britain will never forget the winter of 1963, don't just picture snow. Picture endurance. Picture a country built for mild, wet winters suddenly forced to live through something long and severe. Picture homes where warmth had to be created. Picture a society where convenience wasn't guaranteed. And then picture weeks of deep cold, turning daily life into a constant effort. That's why it's unforgettable. Not because it looked dramatic in photographs. Because it changed the way life felt in real time. In kitchens, in streets, in schools, and inside the body. It wasn't a winter you watched. It was a winter you lived.